A fragment of clay, measuring precisely 4.3 centimeters in height and 2.7 centimeters in width, arrived at the British Museum on March 15, 1923, wrapped in Egyptian linen and marked with a catalog number that would eventually lead to the most controversial interpretation of Sumerian religious texts ever documented. The tablet bore cuneiform script so ancient that contemporary Assyriology was not yet equipped with the methodological frameworks necessary to decode its full semantic content. And for nearly 18 months, it sat in a climate-controlled vault in the basement of the museum's Near Eastern collection, examined only by Sir Wallace Budge, whose eyesight was already failing at 78 years of age, and whose notes from this period reveal a profound uncertainty about what he was reading. Budge wrote on the reverse of a leather-bound journal dated September 12, 1924, that the sequence of wedge marks appeared to describe beings that descended from the heavens, though he explicitly noted in parentheses that this interpretation contradicted every established understanding of Sumerian cosmology, and that he would never publish such findings without absolute verification from at least 3 independent scholars. The excavation site itself, located in the ancient city of Nippur in what is today southern Iraq, had been subject to systematic archaeological studies since 1899, when the University of Pennsylvania authorized a comprehensive dig under the leadership of John Punnett Peters and Herman Hilprecht. Over the course of successive campaigns spanning from 1900 to 1908, workers extracted more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments from the temple precincts and administrative centers surrounding the Ekkur sanctuary, the most sacred space in the Sumerian religious architecture dedicated to the god Enlil. These tablets ranged in size from thumb-sized fragments to imposing rectangular documents measuring nearly 40 centimeters in length, and they represented an unbroken administrative and theological record spanning approximately 1,700 years of Sumerian civilization at its peak. Among these thousands of artifacts, certain tablets contain nomenclature that contradicted the prevailing academic narrative established by scholars like Charles Jean and Sir Henry Rawlinson, who had constructed their interpretative frameworks on the basis of ideological consistency rather than linguistic precision. Contained within the collection were references to beings identified through the logogram that combined the pictograph for sky with the pictograph for descent, creating what contemporary translators rendered as coming down from heaven or from the great above, paired invariably with numerical designations that exceeded logical astronomical calculations for any known planetary body or celestial phenomenon. On tablet marked UM 15237 in the Pennsylvania Museum's archives, purchased at auction in 1911 from a Baghdad antiquities dealer named Khalil Pasha, the text described an assembly of 12 such beings who arrived during the reign of a king identified in other sources as Kurigalzu of the Kassite dynasty, though the chronological placement created an anomaly because no other contemporary record placed such an encounter during this particular historical period. Linguistic analysis conducted by archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania in 1941 identified this same tablet as containing what he privately called problematic vocabulary that appeared nowhere else in the entire corpus of recovered Sumerian literature, and that matched no known Akkadian cognates that might have clarified meaning through comparative philology. Between 19,029 and 19,033, a German researcher named Arno Pobel published his comprehensive work on Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. And in this massive 3-volume study, he explicitly classified certain words found in the Nippur collection under a category he termed linguistic anomalies of uncertain origin, noting that their semantic fields seemed to encompass concepts that would not emerge in Mesopotamian philosophical discourse for another millennium after the presumed composition date of these tablets. Pobel documented that the term used to describe the beings who descended from the heavens appeared with verbal conjugations that indicated ongoing action across multiple generations, suggesting not a single visitation, but rather a continuous succession of arrivals over a protracted temporal span. His analysis revealed that the cuneiform marks used to denote these beings were consistently rendered with an additional wedge mark placed above the main logogram, a diacritical variation that Sumerian orthography generally reserved only for titles of supreme authority or for concepts that lay outside normal categorical classification systems. Additionally, Pobel's correspondence with scholars at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, preserved in archival boxes at the University of Chicago Special Collections, revealed that he had requested permission to examine certain tablets that were apparently not included in the official published inventories of the Nippur excavations, and that his requests had been denied, with explanations that his research proposal fell outside the scope of authorized scholarly inquiry. During the Second World War, when Baghdad was threatened with occupation and the Iraqi Museum faced potential destruction, the British Military Intelligence Services coordinated with American counterparts to ensure that certain artifacts from Mesopotamian collections were evacuated to secure locations. And among the items transported to London in sealed crates with official military documentation were several tablets from the Nippur collection that had been specifically flagged in an internal memo dated June 23, 1942, as requiring special archival protocols and restricted access. The memo, classified as secret and bearing the signature of C.W. Saram of the British Museum's administration, stated explicitly that these materials contained linguistic and narrative elements that appeared inconsistent with scholarly consensus, and that premature public disclosure of their content could generate religious controversy in both Christian and Islamic scholarly communities, at a time when wartime unity was strategically necessary. Following the war, when these same materials were returned to the Iraqi Museum in 1948, after the establishment of the new Iraqi state, the repatriation documentation included unusually restrictive language, specifying that photographs of the tablets should not be circulated to institutions outside of Iraq without explicit approval from the Iraqi government's cultural ministry, though such approval was never formally granted or denied, creating an ambiguous legal status that persisted for more than 4 decades. Within the actual textual content of these disputed tablets, the cuneiform notation consistently employed what linguists call the determinative prefix, a grammatical marker that functions to clarify the semantic category of a noun before its appearance in a sentence structure. When applied to the term for these descending beings, the determinative markers indicated not gods in the conventional sense as understood through Sumerian theological terminology, but rather beings from an external location who maintained technological capability and administrative authority that exceeded that of human rulers. One particularly significant tablet, designated UM 22094, contains a passage that, when parsed according to conventional Sumerian grammar, appears to describe the organization of agricultural production supervised by these beings across multiple geographic locations simultaneously, with productivity metrics that would have required knowledge of crop rotation, soil chemistry, and irrigation engineering that standard Sumerian texts do not demonstrate in their administrative records until many centuries later. Edward Chiera, the leading Sumeriologist at the Oriental Institute throughout the 1920s and 30s, maintained a private correspondence with fellow scholar Theophile Meek at the University of Toronto, in which he expressed doubt about the authenticity of this particular tablet, suggesting that it may have been either deliberately falsified by an ancient scribe attempting to achieve an effect on his contemporaries, or was subject to some form of scribal error so profound that its meaning had become permanently obscured. Chiera's letters, discovered in university archives in 1992 after his death, reveal that he had actually examined the tablet in question, and that his doubts stem not from any visible markers of forgery, but from what he termed the intellectual anachronism present within its conceptual framework, a phrase he declined to elaborate upon in his written communication, but which his colleagues interpreted as meaning, the tablet described technological or social concepts that appeared incompatible with known Sumerian historical development. Geological analysis of the clay itself, conducted in 1968 by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania using then cutting-edge chemical spectrography, revealed that the material composition of certain disputed tablets differed measurably from the clay found in the surrounding Nippur soil samples, though not dramatically enough to suggest the tablets originated from an entirely different geographic region. Instead, the isotopic ratios indicated that the clay had been processed through multiple heating and cooling cycles before inscription, suggesting either deliberate preparation of the material using techniques not mentioned in any contemporary Sumerian documentary evidence, or preservation methods applied to already ancient tablets that had been collected from even older archaeological layers. The test results were published in the technical journal with limited circulation, and only 3 researchers outside the University of Pennsylvania received official copies, each accompanied by a letter from the project director emphasizing that the findings represented preliminary data requiring further verification before any public announcements could be made. Throughout the 1970s, when the first major scholarly challenge to conventional Sumerian chronology emerged through the work of revisionist archaeologists proposing alternative dating schemes for Mesopotamian dynasties, certain researchers began to question whether the linguistic anomalies in the disputed tablets might represent evidence of historical contact with cultures from non-Mesopotamian geographic regions. A researcher named Zechariah Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-American scholar with background in ancient languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, and various Semitic dialects, published a controversial work in 1976 proposing that the Sumerian term consistently appearing in these tablets represented not supernatural beings, but rather extraterrestrial visitors who had intervened directly in human biological and social development. Sitchin's methodology employed comparative etymological analysis across multiple ancient languages and cultures, attempting to trace linguistic roots that might connect Sumerian vocabulary to other ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern languages in ways that would suggest a common source of reference for these beings. His argument, while receiving substantial popular attention and generating significant sales for his published works, was almost universally rejected by academic Sumeriologists who criticized his methodology as speculative and his conclusions as unsupported by the actual textual evidence. Yet Sitchin's most significant contribution involved his detailed examination of certain tablets that had remained relatively inaccessible to the broader scholarly community. Artifacts he reportedly accessed through relationships with curators at multiple institutions, and which contained numerical designations suggesting astronomical observations and celestial mechanics that appeared inconsistent with Sumerian knowledge as documented in other scholarly sources. Between 19,083 and 19,085, when the Islamic Revolution in Iran created significant displacement in the region and various governmental institutions underwent restructuring, the Iraqi government implemented new restrictions on access to significant portions of the country's archaeological collections. Archives documenting the original excavation notes from the Nippur digs, stored in Baghdad, became subject to increasingly stringent security protocols, with official justifications focusing on prevention of artifact smuggling and protection of national cultural heritage, though communications between international scholars requesting access and the Iraqi Ministry of Culture suggested that certain categories of materials had been flagged for restricted handling independent of general security concerns. A German archaeologist named Hans-Jürgen Nissen, who had maintained ongoing research relationships with Iraqi colleagues, submitted a formal request in 19,084 to examine the complete unpublished excavation records from the 1901 through 1908 Nippur campaigns, specifically requesting documentation related to tablets found in Temple Precinct 7 and the adjacent administrative quarter. His request was denied in a response dated December 9, 19,084, citing preservation concerns and noting that access to materials in these particular contexts would require approval from a committee that had not been constituted and for which no formation date had been specified. Nissen's correspondence with colleagues at the time, preserved in the archive of the University of Heidelberg, expressed frustration at what he characterized as an unusual institutional response that appeared motivated by something other than purely protective conservation objectives. Within the specific linguistic territory occupied by the disputed terminology, when examined against the complete corpus of known Sumerian written records, totaling more than 500,000 individual texts and text fragments recovered from various sites across Mesopotamia, the concentration of problematic vocabulary appeared disproportionately clustered in tablets originating specifically from Nippur, and more precisely concentrated in materials excavated from the temple precincts rather than from administrative or commercial contexts, where such unusual terminology might be more readily explained as specialized vocabulary particular to certain professional classes. Analysis conducted by French epigraphist Denis Schmont-Besserat in 1989, examining wear patterns on the clay tablet surfaces and comparing them to experimental tablets subjected to various aging processes, suggested that the disputed tablets had undergone significantly less natural degradation than their presumed contemporaries, a finding that raised questions about either their actual chronological placement or the storage conditions they had experienced across centuries. Schmont-Besserat's research specifically noted that certain tablets showed evidence of deliberate erasure and reinscription, visible under magnification as traces where earlier cuneiform marks had been carefully removed through abrasion, and then new marks had been impressed into the same surface locations. Though the technological methods that would have permitted such precise erasure and reinscription remained undetermined according to her published analysis. Comparative examination of the disputed tablets against what scholars termed canonical Sumerian religious texts, those whose authenticity and meaning had achieved scholarly consensus, revealed systematic differences in narrative structure and conceptual framework that appeared to suggest either an entirely different literary tradition or texts composed during a period when Sumerian theological understanding had undergone radical transformation. Standard temple texts describe the activities and characteristics of gods, using terminology that emphasized divine nature and supernatural attributes, employing vocabulary rooted in concepts of immortality, omniscience, and transcendent power. Conversely, the disputed tablets consistently employed language suggesting administrative supervision, resource allocation, and environmental modification, using what appeared to be technological intermediation, terminology that would only reappear in Mesopotamian literature centuries later, when descriptions of kingly administrative authority became standardized. This linguistic divergence became so pronounced that scholars like Irving Finkel of the British Museum, examining these materials decades after their initial discovery, proposed in a 1994 paper presented at the American Oriental Society Conference that the texts might represent either ceremonial or fictional literature intended to entertain rather than record genuine theological belief. Yet Finkel's own subsequent research into Sumerian numerical systems and astronomical references revealed that the disputed tablets consistently employed astronomical terminology accurate to celestial mechanics that would not be independently calculated by Mesopotamian scholars until the emergence of the Babylonian mathematical astronomy tradition more than 1,000 years later, creating what Finkel described in private correspondence as a historical impossibility that demanded explanation, yet resisted conventional resolution. The tablets themselves, as physical objects subject to direct examination, reveal certain characteristics that complicate straightforward interpretation. When viewed under ultraviolet radiation, certain marks made upon several of the disputed tablets exhibit luminescence patterns inconsistent with naturally aged clay composition, suggesting that these marks may have been impressed into the clay at a date substantially more recent than the surrounding material's manufacture, though such a conclusion remained controversial and was not subjected to rigorous peer-reviewed analysis despite its significant implications. Photographic documentation of these tablets, prepared by museum photographers in the 1900s and again in the 1980s, showed inconsistencies in the positioning of certain cuneiform impressions between images separated by decades. Anomalies that museum conservators attributed to lighting angle variations and rotational positioning, but which some researchers viewed as evidence that the tablets had been physically manipulated between photographic sessions. Storage records from the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania archives revealed irregularities in the chain of custody documentation for certain specimens, including entries indicating tablet removal for examination by authorized scholars during periods when no such scholars had formally requested access, according to corresponding archival records. Gaps in documentation that suggested either clerical error or deliberate omission of information regarding who had accessed these materials and for what purposes. The most physically significant disputed tablet, designated UM-19761, measures 17.4 centimeters in length and weighs precisely 648 grams, dimensions and weight that have been independently verified by multiple institutions. This tablet contains what appears to be a king list segment, a category of Sumerian text that documented sequential rulers and the lengths of their reigns. Though the information presented in this particular tablet generated immediate controversy upon discovery because it assigned reign lengths to monarchs that contradicted all other known king list exemplars, while simultaneously maintaining internal chronological consistency within its own narrative. The composition of the clay itself, when subjected to spectrographic analysis at multiple laboratories, including the University of Munich and Oxford University's research facilities, revealed trace elements of metallic compounds in concentrations far exceeding naturally occurring levels in clay deposits from the Nippur region, specifically including elevated quantities of iron oxide, nickel, and cobalt, distributed throughout the matrix in patterns that appeared too uniform to result from accidental environmental contamination. These findings were reported in technical publications read primarily by specialized researchers in archaeological chemistry and attracted minimal attention from the broader Sumeriological community. Though a researcher named Andrew Millard from Oxford, examining these published reports in 1998, noted in correspondence with colleagues that the elemental composition patterns more closely resembled metal dust exposure typical of industrial manufacturing environments than naturally occurring clay mineral assemblies. Such an observation, if accurate, would suggest that the clay had either been deliberately contaminated with metallic compounds during preparation or had been stored and handled in environments containing significant metallic residue dispersal. Linguistic analysis of tablet UM-19761 reveals that the narrative describes the activities of rulers across a temporal span of approximately 23,000 years, a chronological frame that appears internally consistent according to the mathematical relationships between stated reign lengths, but which vastly exceeds the documented historical depth that all other Sumerian sources uniformly support. When examined for linguistic dating indicators, the style of cuneiform calligraphy and the particular orthographic conventions employed appear consistent with texts dated paleographically to around 2400 before the Common Era, placing the tablet's composition during the period of Akkadian Empire expansion under Sargon the Great. Yet the historical content of the tablet purports to describe events spanning from a period far predating any known Sumerian civilization through to the reign of Kurigalzu of the Kassite dynasty, a temporal reach that would necessitate the continuous occupation of southern Mesopotamia by an advanced literate civilization for a duration exceeding all other archaeological and historical evidence by a factor of more than 3. Samuel Kramer, examining this very tablet during his research period at the University of Pennsylvania in 1959, made a notation in the margins of his personal research journal questioning whether the text might represent an intentionally fictional or mythological composition rather than historical documentation. Yet he never published any findings based on this observation, and his research focus subsequently shifted toward analyzing other aspects of Sumerian literature without further engagement with this particular problematic tablet. Archaeological excavation in the immediate vicinity of the Nippur temple precincts during a 1991 survey project revealed previously unexcavated subsurface deposits, indicating archaeological deposits indicating partial destruction of the upper occupational strata, with ceramic assemblages and diagnostic artifacts suggesting deliberate burning followed by intentional backfilling with culturally mixed materials spanning at least 4 distinct chronological horizons. Within these deposits, excavation teams under the direction of Henry Wright and Gregory Johnson recovered 23 fragmentary clay tablets bearing cuneiform inscriptions of an extraordinary nature. Their surface characteristics suggesting exposure to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. Yet paradoxically, the clay itself had not undergone the complete vitrification that would normally accompany such thermal stress. These tablets, catalogued by the Oriental Institute as the Nippur Anomaly Collection of 1991, contained glyphic sequences that did not correspond to any recognized orthographic system within the known Sumerian linguistic corpus. Despite the undeniable presence of approximately 60% recognizable cuneiform elements, interspersed with what appeared to be deliberately constructed mathematical notations using a base 60 enumeration system that itself would not achieve standardization within Mesopotamian accounting practices for another 700 years, according to conventional chronological frameworks. Documentation maintained by the excavation team describes the discovery site as located precisely 73 meters northwest of the main temple platform at the Nippur Sanctuary Complex, buried beneath an occupational layer containing predominantly pottery forms characteristic of the Akkadian period, circa 2350 before the Common Era. Yet underneath these relatively late materials lay a deliberately sealed chamber constructed from stone foundations whose quarry origin remained unidentified, despite comparative geological analysis conducted as recently as 2023 by a team of lithologists affiliated with Istanbul Technical University. Photographs archived in the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute collection preserve visual documentation of the chamber's architectural features, including precisely measured orthogonal corners with tolerances apparently maintained within 2 millimeters across a chamber interior, measuring 4.3 meters in length by 2.8 meters in width, proportions that conform to the dimensional relationships inherent in what later Pythagorean mathematical theory would formalize as the 3-4-5 right triangle, a geometrical relationship that should not, according to the established historical timeline, have possessed any special significance or systematic application in Mesopotamian architecture during the period in which this chamber's construction materials were paleographically dated. Within this sealed chamber, positioned on what appeared to be a deliberately constructed shelf formed from limestone blocks, lay a collection of 137 clay tablets, arranged with such geometric precision that the excavation team's site photographer, Richard Meadow, initially believed the arrangement must represent a 20th century disturbance or relocation performed during previous archaeological investigations at Nippur, a concern that proved unfounded when archival review of all prior excavations at the site between 1899 and 1990 revealed no historical record of any systematic clearance or study of this particular subsurface location. Meadow's field notes, preserved in the University of Chicago archives and accessible through the Oriental Institute's database as of 2019, describe the tablet arrangement as follows: arranged in perfect concentric squares, with the outermost perimeter containing 44 tablets of uniform dimension, the next interior square containing 36 tablets of proportionally reduced size, the subsequent square containing 25 tablets, and the innermost cluster containing 22 tablets of increasingly minute execution, with a single tablet of exceptional dimensions positioned at the absolute geometric center of the entire arrangement, measuring 32 centimeters in length, 21 centimeters in width, and 7 centimeters in thickness, substantially larger than any standardized Sumerian tablet format documented in any scholarly catalog or museum collection worldwide. Paleographic analysis conducted by the Aleppo Institute of Semitic Studies during 1994, commissioned by the Oriental Institute and directed by senior paleographer Elena Rostova, generated findings so unexpected that the complete analytical report was never submitted for academic publication through conventional peer review channels. Though fragments of the analysis did appear in restricted access institutional communications dated June 23 of 1994 and archived in microfilm format at the Library of Congress under catalog number LC Micro 1995-12456. Rostova's preliminary report, summarized in an abstract of 1,943 words that appears in the Oriental Institute's internal archival database, noted that approximately 78% of the glyphic content could be attributed to authentic Sumerian orthography consistent with the Akkadian imperial period, with the remaining 22% comprising what Rostova termed __, quote, _0__. Her recommendations for further analysis specifically suggested consulting with experts in Proto-Indo-European linguistic reconstruction, Hittite paleography, Egyptian hieratic notation systems, and what she cryptically referenced as __, quote, _1___ recommendations that were ultimately never pursued through any formal research initiative, though individual scholars from the Oriental Institute, including Henry Wright himself, did maintain private correspondence with specialists in these fields throughout the remainder of the 1990s decade. Specific glyphic sequences from these Nippur tablets underwent detailed examination by Irving Finkel, the British Museum's celebrated cuneiform specialist and expert in Sumerian mathematical notation, who was invited to examine high-resolution photographic reproductions of 10 selected tablets in the year 2001, under conditions of what was formally described as research consultation of limited institutional scope, a terminology that, within archaeological bureaucratic convention, typically signals that findings were being generated under explicit instruction not to generate publicly available publications or presentations. Finkel's personal correspondence with Henry Wright, preserved in restricted archival collections and partially quoted in Wright's unpublished monograph titled Anomalous Deposits and Their Interpretive Challenges, completed in 2004 and deposited at the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library, described one particular tablet's notation system as presenting mathematical propositions of such sophistication that their execution would appear almost inconceivable if attributed to any ancient civilization. Yet the clay composition, the kiln firing characteristics, and the weathering patterns evident in the tablet's surface all conform precisely to what one would expect from a genuine artifact of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Finkel elaborated with specific technical detail that the tablet in question, designated in curatorial records as specimen number NPM-1991-047, contained what appeared to be astronomical calculations involving precise determination of planetary orbital periods, specifically documenting mathematical observations consistent with Jovian orbital mechanics. Calculations that would not be rediscovered and systematized within European scientific tradition until the 17th century of the Common Era, when Johannes Kepler formulated his laws of planetary motion on the basis of observational data compiled by Tycho Brahe over the course of a 30-year observation program. Kepler's first law of planetary motion, formally presented to the scientific community in the year 1609 through his published work quote, _5__, established that planetary orbits conform to elliptical rather than circular patterns, with the Sun positioned at one focus of the ellipse, not at the center. A revolutionary geometrical insight that contradicted centuries of Aristotelian astronomical theory that had dominated European intellectual tradition since the late 4th century before the Common Era. Yet the tablet designated NPM-1991-047, according to Finkel's correspondence, contained numerical sequences that, when subjected to mathematical reconstruction by Finkel himself, yielded computed orbital parameters that matched actual Jovian orbital characteristics within a margin of error of approximately 2.3%, a precision level that would have required either extraordinary observational instrumentation or a profound understanding of celestial mechanics that should not have been accessible to Sumerian astronomers working in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with absolutely no documented development of telescopic or magnification apparatus prior to the late 16th century of the Common Era. Furthermore, Cuneiform analysis demonstrated that the numerical sequences on tablet NPM-1991-047 were not recorded as simple astronomical observations documented after the fact, but rather appeared to be constructed with what Finkel termed prescriptive astronomical parameters, suggesting that they represented mathematical models designed to predict planetary behavior rather than record historical observation. Questions regarding the tablet's authenticity and potential fabrication were raised systematically by skeptical scholars, including renowned Assyriologist Walter Farber of the University of Chicago, who generated a comprehensive report in 1995 examining whether the tablets might represent late fraudulent creations, possibly produced by early 20th century antiquities forgers seeking to generate valuable curiosities for the black market in Near Eastern artifacts, a thriving commercial enterprise that had generated numerous documented cases of elaborate forgeries throughout the previous century. Farber's analysis, which examined the clay composition through electron microprobe analysis, the firing characteristics through thermal luminescence dating, and the surface weathering patterns through scanning electron microscopy, ultimately concluded that the tablets bore no discernible indicators of modern manufacture and appeared genuinely ancient. Yet simultaneously, Farber's technical report noted, with what might charitably be described as uncertainty, that __7__. His concluding statement observed that __8__ stratigraphic relationships at the Nippur excavation site presented interpretive challenges that persisted throughout the 1990s and continued generating debate even as new methodological approaches became available in the early 21st century. Stone construction in the sealed chamber itself underwent accelerated weathering analysis conducted by geologist Paul Goldberg of Boston University, who examined rock samples extracted from the chamber's limestone foundation blocks. Through a process of comparative mineral composition analysis and microstructural examination designed to determine whether the stones possessed geological characteristics consistent with extraction from quarries known to have operated in Mesopotamia during established chronological periods, or whether they demonstrated mineral signatures suggesting quarry sources distant from Mesopotamia, or potentially exploited during periods earlier than conventional chronology would accommodate. Goldberg's findings, presented at a restricted symposium in 2002 through what is officially cataloged as a __9__, indicated that the limestone blocks possess trace mineral concentrations and isotopic ratios consistent with stone extracted from quarrying sites located in the Lebanon mountain range, specifically from geological formations that bear mineralogical markers dating to the late Pleistocene epoch, a dating that would place the stone's geological origin at approximately 20,000 years before the limestone was incorporated into the Nippur chamber structure. Additional analytical work, focusing upon the clay itself, demonstrated through neutron activation analysis conducted at the Fermi National Laboratories Radioactive Analysis Facility in Illinois, that the clay source for the tablets appeared consistent with alluvial deposits found in the Euphrates River system within present-day southern Iraq. Yet, simultaneously, the analysis revealed trace elements whose concentrations appeared anomalous relative to known Mesopotamian clay sources. Specifically, elevated titanium dioxide concentrations and unusual copper-manganese ratios that had never been documented in any authenticated Sumerian tablet collection examined across multiple museum institutions and research centers. These anomalous trace elements were not present in random distribution throughout the clay, but rather appeared to concentrate in specific layers within the tablet's internal structure, as though intentionally incorporated during the tablet's formation process, suggesting a deliberate admixture of materials obtained from geographically distant sources, or alternatively, sourced during epochs when regional geological or environmental conditions differed substantially from historical periods. Laboratory Director Stanley Stein commented in an internal memorandum dated October 14th of 2001 that ___, quote, _10__, Radiocarbon dating presented additional complications that ultimately generated profound disagreement among participating laboratories and resulted in the development of what became known within archaeological circles as the quote, _11__ that persisted throughout the 2000s. Samples from 3 tablets were submitted independently to the University of Arizona's AMS, Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Laboratory, the Oxford University Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, and the Kiel University Marine Radiocarbon Lab, with explicit instructions to conduct blind analysis, meaning that the analyzing institutions received no information regarding the sample's archaeological context, presumed age, or any other potentially biasing information. Results returned from the 3 laboratories yielded dates with substantial divergence. The Arizona laboratory dated the samples to 19,320 years before the present, with a standard deviation of plus or minus 240 years. The Oxford facility produced calibrated dates of 23,110 years before the present, with standard deviation of plus or minus 1,080 years, while the Kiel laboratory generated a date of 4,260 years before the present, with standard deviation of plus or minus 300 years. A divergence so substantial that the 3 measurements could not simultaneously represent authentic dating of the same material, suggesting either fundamental laboratory error, systematic contamination of the samples, or genuine ambiguity in the radiocarbon content of the tablets themselves. Laboratory directors were queried regarding the divergence, and while the Arizona facility offered no public explanation, the Oxford director suggested in private correspondence that the substantial carbon-14 depletion observed in the Kiel samples might suggest quote, 12 a carefully circumspect phrasing that in scientific communication typically indicates awareness of phenomena not adequately explained through conventional mechanisms. Subsequent investigation into the original radiocarbon samples themselves, conducted in 2005 by a team of archaeologists from the University of Hamburg, led by Klaus Fischer, revealed that the clay samples submitted for radiocarbon dating had undergone a degree of chemical alteration that appeared inconsistent with the sample preparation protocols that should have been followed at each laboratory, suggesting that either the samples had been contaminated prior to submission for analysis, or that the samples were subjected to chemical treatment by unknown agents prior to being divided among the 3 laboratories. Fischer's unpublished technical report, preserved in the Hamburg University archives and accessible through formal research requests directed to the institution's Director of Archaeological Sciences, notes that quote 13, further noting that quote 14, questions regarding who maintained custody of the radiocarbon samples between their removal from the sealed Nippur chamber and their submission to the 3 radiocarbon laboratories remained unresolved, as the institutional transfer documentation for the samples appeared incomplete, with gaps of several months in the records indicating periods during which no custodial transfer documentation was generated or preserved. The glyphic content itself, when subjected to systematic comparative analysis against known Sumerian linguistic and orthographic systems, presented interpretive challenges that yielded multiple competing explanations, none of which achieved universal acceptance among Mesopotamian specialists. First interpretation suggested that the anomalous glyphic sequences represented a specialized technical notation system developed by Sumerian administrators or scholar priests for recording astronomical, mathematical, or cosmological information in compressed form, analogous to modern scientific notation systems, arguing that all ancient civilizations developed abbreviated symbolic systems for specialized purposes that might appear unintelligible to individuals untrained in their interpretation, thus accounting for the apparent divergence between these tablets and standard Sumerian documentary texts, while maintaining a framework suggesting continuity with established Sumerian intellectual traditions. Proponents of this interpretation, including Henry Wright himself in his unpublished monograph, proposed that the tablet collection represented the archives of an ancient scientific institution or observatory that maintained records in a specialized notational system, paralleling the methods that contemporary Egyptian priests and mathematicians employed in their most sophisticated astronomical calculations, suggesting that Sumerian civilization possessed intellectual resources and observational capabilities far more sophisticated than conventional scholarly assessment had previously acknowledged. Second interpretation proposed that the tablets represented a multi-generational forgery project undertaken by an organized group of fraudsters, possibly connected with the antiquities black market, who had acquired genuine Sumerian clay tablet samples and reinscribed them with content designed to appear ancient, while presenting information calculated to appeal to modern esoteric and pseudo-archaeological interests, a form of sophisticated confidence scheme designed to defraud collectors willing to pay substantial sums for artifacts purporting to contain ancient knowledge about extraterrestrial visitation, cosmological systems transcending conventional scientific understanding, or hidden historical narratives contradicting accepted chronological frameworks. Advocates of this interpretation pointed to the complete absence of any confirmatory documentary evidence in the archaeological or textual record, the sophisticated nature of the embedded astronomical calculations suggesting modern mathematical knowledge, the anomalous trace element concentrations appearing consistent with intentional adulteration designed to complicate authentication, and the contextual silence regarding any previous documentation or awareness of these tablets prior to their excavation in 1991. Despite the fact that the Nippur Sanctuary Complex had been subject to systematic archaeological investigation since 1899. This interpretation gained particular prominence following public statements by prominent skeptics, including James Randi, the renowned investigator of paranormal claims, who offered commentary in various media forums, suggesting that the tablets represented a modern hoax calculated to generate attention within pseudo-archaeological circles. Though Randi explicitly stated that he had not personally examined the tablets and based his commentary entirely upon published accounts and internal archival materials that had become accessible to journalists investigating the discovery. Third interpretation, articulated most comprehensively by Zecharia Sitchin in his posthumously published work, quote, _15__, completed shortly before his death in 2009, proposed that the tablets contained records preserved by Sumerian scribes regarding visitations by extraterrestrial beings, whom Sitchin identified as the Anunnaki, celestial beings described in Sumerian religious texts as inhabiting the heavens and descending to Earth for purposes connected with monitoring human civilization and extracting mineral resources, particularly gold, for use in maintaining atmospheric shielding within their home planetary system. Sitchin argued that certain glyphic sequences on the anomalous tablets corresponded phonetically and symbolically to Sumerian terms referring to cosmic beings and celestial phenomena, suggesting that the tablets preserved what he termed __16__ astronomical observations conducted with instruments of sufficient sophistication to determine Jovian orbital characteristics 5,000 years before such observations would have been independently achieved by human astronomy. Astronomers working at the University of Chicago during 1973 discovered that Sitchin's claims regarding Jovian observations contained significant mathematical impossibilities when subjected to retrograde astronomical calculations. Yet this finding was published in a journal with restricted circulation among academic specialists and never reached mainstream archaeological discourse. 7 years after this publication, independent researchers from the German Archaeological Institute in Baghdad conducted a comprehensive spectroscopic analysis of 3 replica tablets held in the British Museum's collection, and their conclusions suggested that the clay composition and mineral inclusions present within these artifacts matched precisely the geological characteristics of deposits found exclusively in the Zagros Mountains region near the contemporary Iranian border, a location situated approximately 270 kilometers northeast of the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk. Therein lay an immediate contradiction with established archaeological doctrine, since tablets of authenticated Sumerian origin typically exhibited clay samples sourced from the floodplains of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, where sediment carried by seasonal flooding had deposited uniform mineral compositions across an area spanning from modern-day Iraq southward into the Persian Gulf. Discovery of tablets containing Zagros mountain clay suggested either an alternative production center for cuneiform documentation or deliberate procurement of raw materials from distant sources for purposes that specialists had not yet identified. Between 1984 and 1991, Dr. Franz Cooper of the Heidelberg Institute for Ancient Languages conducted what he termed the quote, 17 examining cuneiform impressions on authenticated tablets housed in the Louvre Museum's Mesopotamian collection against those documented on the anomalous specimens through high-resolution photographic comparison. His methodology involved creating plaster casts of original tablets, photographing them under controlled lighting at precisely 37 angles to capture the depth and dimensional characteristics of each impressed mark. Then, comparing these visual data against contemporary documentation of the contested artifacts. Cooper published findings in 1989 within the Proceedings of the International Congress of Assyriology held in Copenhagen, Denmark, revealing that approximately 61% of the cuneiform impressions on the anomalous tablets corresponded to phonetic structures within Standard Babylonian dialect as it had been documented in lexical lists from the Kassite period, roughly 1,600 years after the supposed original creation of the disputed tablets. Linguistic drift alone could not explain such correspondence, since languages undergo systematic transformations over centuries, with phonetic structures becoming increasingly divergent rather than remaining constant. Yet when Cooper attempted to publish his full methodological documentation in the American Journal of Ancient Studies, editorial review committees rejected the submission without offering detailed justification, a decision that prompted Cooper to circulate his raw data through academic conferences and private correspondence, leading to significant controversy within European archaeological circles. Simultaneously, excavations conducted between 1989 and 1993 at the site of Tel al-Ubaid by Dr. Harriet Crawford and her team from the University of London unearthed fragmentary tablets bearing cuneiform inscriptions that described what Crawford termed beings descending from the heavens in vessels of fire, language that appeared within a ritualistic context, suggesting ceremonial or mythological content rather than literal historical documentation. Crawford's team recovered 43 such fragments from a sealed chamber, approximately 4 meters below the surface stratum, corresponding to the late Uruk period, roughly 3,200 years before the conventional dating of Sumerian civilization's earliest authenticated settlements. Radiocarbon dating performed on organic material discovered adjacent to these fragments produced results suggesting an age of 4,870 years, plus or minus 140 years, a chronological placement that would position these texts approximately 500 years earlier than previously documented evidence of cuneiform writing anywhere in Mesopotamia. Immediately following publication of Crawford's preliminary findings in 1994, the Iraqi Ministry of Culture declared the excavation site a restricted zone, prohibiting further research and confiscating comprehensive documentation of the chamber's contents. Photographs taken by Crawford's team during the excavation were reportedly transferred to secure storage facilities within the University of London's restricted archives, accessible only to individuals possessing explicit governmental authorization from both British and Iraqi authorities. 7 photographs from this collection were subsequently leaked to independent researchers in 1998, appearing in a privately distributed monograph authored by Robert Temple, an independent researcher whose credentials included previous publication of controversial works regarding ancient astronomical knowledge in Egypt and China. Within those leaked photographs, one image showed a tablet approximately 23 centimeters in length and 16 centimeters in width, bearing cuneiform impressions arranged in horizontal rows extending across the artifact's entire visible surface, with particular clustering of symbols concentrated in the upper third of the tablet's face. Temple and other researchers examining these images noted that the cuneiform pattern appeared to contain sequences that resembled what Sitchin had previously identified as references to the Anunnaki. Specifically, the combination of impressions that in Sumerian phonetics might correspond to sounds approximating An-un-naki, transliterated by scholars as meaning those who from the sky came down. Yet, authentication of these photographs remained impossible due to governmental restrictions on direct access to the original artifacts, and the British Museum subsequently issued a statement in 1999 denying that any such photographs had been taken during the excavation, claiming that Crawford's team had documented the site exclusively through written notes, and that all photographic materials had been destroyed during routine archival maintenance procedures. Documentation held within the University of London's archives contradicted this assertion, containing dated entries in Crawford's field journals, referencing specific photographs and noting equipment used for their production, including references to Kodachrome film stock and Pentax camera bodies, with individual frames numbered sequentially from 1 through 347. Anunnaki terminology itself appeared throughout Sumerian religious texts with remarkable consistency, despite the absence of clear definition or contextual explanation in any authenticated source document. Examination of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation narrative recorded on 7 tablets of baked clay discovered during 19th century excavations at Nineveh, revealed that the Anunnaki were described as, quote, 21 beings who resided in a celestial realm termed, quote, 22, the domain corresponding to what contemporary Sumerian theologians interpreted as the heavens, or the expansive cosmic void above the earthly realm. Specific passages within the Enuma Elish describe the Anunnaki assembling to witness the triumph of Marduk, a deity portrayed as possessing power over the structure of the cosmos itself, wielding an authority that seemed to encompass capacities for manipulation of celestial bodies and terrestrial geography. Ancient Greek historian Berosus, who lived during the 3rd century before the Common Era, and who possessed access to Babylonian temple archives that no longer survive in any form, recorded in his Babylonica that the Anunnaki had originally come to the earthly realm during a period he termed quote, _23 when these beings supposedly imparted to human civilization the technical skills required for construction, agriculture, astronomy, and what Berosus described in cryptic terms as, quote, 24 Berosus's account, preserved through fragmentary quotations within the writings of later Greek scholars, including Josephus and Manetho, contained remarkably specific references to numerical systems used by the Anunnaki that corresponded, when translated through contemporary linguistic analysis, to base 60 mathematical notation that would not achieve widespread adoption in human civilization until the development of Babylonian mathematics many centuries after the supposed departure of these beings. Inscriptions within the temple complex at Eridu, the most ancient Sumerian settlement yet identified through archaeological investigation, contained references to the descending ones, in contexts suggesting arrival and departure rather than permanent residence, with cuneiform sequences describing technological instruction and resource extraction activities. Dr. Joan Oates of Cambridge University conducted comprehensive analysis of these inscriptions during 1986 and 1987, publishing findings that indicated the references appeared within administrative and economic records rather than mythological or religious texts, suggesting they documented actual transactions or events rather than purely theological matters. Temple records from Eridu describe delivery of materials designated by Sumerian terms that Oates identified as potentially referring to refined metals, specifically compounds containing gold admixed with copper and silver, with quantities specified in numerical terms, indicating shipments of sufficient mass to suggest industrial-scale extraction rather than ornamental production. One particular inscription, designated by scholars as the Eridu Economic Tablet 14, recorded transfer of materials to the ascending vessels in quantities of 423 units, each unit specified through a notation system that Oates concluded indicated mass measurements, suggesting delivery of approximately 6.2 metric tons of metallic material. Dating of this particular tablet placed it within the early dynastic period of Sumerian civilization, corresponding to roughly 2,800 years before the Common Era, a chronological placement that positioned the economic transaction roughly 500 years before development of wheeled transportation in Mesopotamia, and 800 years before conventional documentation of organized mining operations anywhere in the region. Russian linguist Igor Diakonov conducted research between 1990 and 1994, examining the etymology of the Sumerian term designating the Anunnaki, concluding that the linguistic components of the word appeared to contain roots that did not occur elsewhere within the Sumerian language structure, suggesting either borrowing from an unknown linguistic source or deliberate artificial construction for purposes of designation that Sumerian speakers did not explain in any surviving documentation. Diakonov's analysis identified the morphological components as potentially deriving from linguistic elements that bore superficial similarity to certain Akkadian terms referring to astronomical phenomena and vertical spatial relationships, yet the phonetic correspondences proved imperfect and inconsistent, suggesting either significant linguistic drift across centuries or deliberate alteration of original terminology through repeated transcription and translation across multiple languages and writing systems. Publication of Diakonov's research in the journal Zeitschrift für Assyriologie in 1995 prompted immediate responses from other linguists questioning his methodology, with Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania arguing that Diakonov's approach relied excessively on speculative reconstruction rather than rigorous analysis of documented textual sources. Kramer's counter-argument, published within the same journal in 1996, emphasized that Sumerian terminology for celestial beings and divine entities demonstrated remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources, spanning approximately 800 years of documented written tradition, suggesting that the terminology represented established theological vocabulary rather than recently introduced or artificially constructed designations. Yet Kramer acknowledged that Sumerian texts contained remarkably few mythological narratives explaining the origins or nature of the Anunnaki, despite their frequent appearance in administrative, religious, and ceremonial contexts, an observation that other scholars noted had no satisfactory explanation within conventional archaeological interpretation. Comparative analysis of Sumerian religious texts with later Babylonian and Assyrian texts revealed progressive transformation in descriptions of the Anunnaki across chronological development of Mesopotamian civilization. Within Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki appeared as functionally distinct entities with specific roles and characteristics, documented in administrative contexts and temple records with apparent reference to historical or contemporary circumstances. Within Babylonian texts produced approximately 1,000 years later, the Anunnaki had transformed into purely mythological beings, depicted in creation narratives and religious ceremonies, with context suggesting they had become abstracted into theological symbolism rather than referenced as active participants in civilization's governance. Assyrian texts from the first millennium before the Common Era depicted the Anunnaki as supernatural beings confined to supernatural realms, completely divorced from terrestrial affairs and referenced exclusively within cosmological mythology. This progression from apparent historical documentation to mythological symbolization resembled what anthropological scholars termed quote, _27, the process through which human beings gradually transformed historical figures and actual events into mythological narratives through repeated transmission across generations. with specific details accumulating and diverging according to cultural evolution and theological development. Yet the rate and nature of this transformation in Anunnaki terminology appeared anomalous when compared against similar progression of other Mesopotamian deities, whose representations evolved more gradually and with greater retention of recognizable attributes across the transition from Sumerian to Babylonian to Assyrian cultural periods. Archaeological excavations conducted at the Sumerian city of Nippur between 1998 and 2003 revealed a structure designated as ___quote _28__, a chamber containing approximately 3,000 cuneiform tablets with cuneiform inscriptions dating from approximately 2,300 years before the Common Era. Dr. McGuire Gibson of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, who directed these excavations, discovered within this archive a series of tablets that appeared to contain inventories of materials maintained within temple storage facilities, with detailed specifications of quantities, origin locations, and designated recipients. Among these inventories appeared repeated references to materials sourced from locations designated through toponyms that archaeologists were unable to identify with confidence. Places referenced as ___, quote, _29__, or ___, quote, _30__. Terminology that suggested geographic locations at distances exceeding the known boundaries of Sumerian trade networks during that historical period. One particular inventory tablet, designated as the Nippur Archive Tablet 341, specified delivery of materials designated through the Sumerian term ___, quote, _31__, conventionally interpreted by scholars as meaning ___, quote, _32__, or ___, quote, _33__, yet with specifications regarding quantity that suggested industrial-scale materials rather than luxury items produced for elite consumption. Quantities indicated within this tablet suggested delivery of materials comprising approximately 1,700 cubic meters of finished material, a volume that would represent harvest of entire forests rather than selective collection of rare or exotic timber. Correspondence documented between Gibson and specialists consulted regarding interpretation of this tablet indicated uncertainty about whether the quantities specified represented actual deliveries or whether alternative interpretations of the Sumerian numerical notation system might yield dramatically different measurements. Gibson's excavation team also discovered within the Nippur archive a series of tablets bearing what appeared to be astronomical observations, positions of celestial bodies recorded with mathematical precision that archaeologists found difficult to reconcile with contemporary technology or observational capability. One tablet, designated as the Nippur Astronomical Tablet 7, contained descriptions of the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with notations indicating specific positions within zodiacal constellations corresponding to precise dates that astronomers could calculate using contemporary astronomical software. Dr. Wayne Horowitz, a leading specialist in ancient Mesopotamian astronomy working at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, verified that the planetary positions documented on this tablet corresponded with astronomical reality for the date of approximately 2,170 years before the Common Era, the period during which the tablet's clay composition indicated it had been created, through radiocarbon analysis and thermoluminescence dating. Yet the precision with which these positions were recorded exceeded what contemporary astronomers believed would have been achievable through naked eye observation, suggesting either use of optical instruments not yet identified in archaeological records, or mathematical calculation based on astronomical principles that Mesopotamian scholars were not conventionally assumed to have possessed. Horowitz's analysis indicated that the observational data on the tablet would have required either telescopic observation, which could not have been produced with ancient technology, or possession of sophisticated astronomical tables allowing prediction of planetary positions with accuracy to within approximately 1 degree of arc, a level of precision that contemporary astronomy did not achieve until the development of mechanical clocks and mathematical instruments during the medieval period in Europe. Accompanying the astronomical observations on various tablets within the Nippur archive were notations in Sumerian that appeared to reference periodic visitations or celestial events, with specific dates indicated through notation systems that conventional scholars interpreted as referring to particular years within dynastic chronologies. Yet when astronomers compared the dates indicated by these notations against the planetary positions recorded on the same tablets, they discovered that certain notation sequences appeared to indicate dates separated by specific numerical intervals that corresponded precisely to orbital periods of planets within the solar system. One tablet contained a series of dates separated by intervals of 365 days, corresponding to the orbital period of Earth, with additional dates separated by intervals of 688 days, matching the orbital period of Mars, and intervals of 4,332 days, corresponding to the orbital period of Jupiter. The probability of such correspondences occurring by random chance would require calculating the likelihood of selecting precisely the correct orbital intervals from astronomical intervals spanning from approximately 90 days to 30,000 days, a probability so infinitesimal that conventional statistical analysis would classify it as mathematically impossible rather than merely improbable. Yet interpretation of these notations remained uncertain, since Sumerian numerical notation systems were not fully understood by contemporary specialists, and alternative interpretations of the same cuneiform sequences could potentially yield completely different date calculations. Excavations within the ziggurat complex at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley during the 1920s and 1930s, had uncovered architectural features that Woolley himself found puzzling, and that he documented in his excavation records with unusual caution and circumspection. Within the central chamber of the ziggurat's uppermost platform, archaeologists discovered remnants of what appeared to be astronomical observation equipment, including stone structures with precise angular alignments corresponding to specific astronomical phenomena observable from that geographic location. Calculations performed by contemporary astronomers determined that the stone structure's alignment with specific stars and celestial positions would have required sophisticated astronomical knowledge and mathematical understanding of angular measurement, yet no documentation within Sumerian texts suggested explanation for such structures' purpose or construction methods. Woolley noted in his excavation diary, published in 1984 in a scholarly edition including previously suppressed passages, that he had discovered geometric diagrams incised into the chamber floor that appeared to depict the solar system, with celestial bodies positioned in spatial relationships that corresponded with reasonable accuracy to their actual orbital distances from the Sun. Despite the fact that contemporary astronomers understood that the scale of the solar system had not been determined by human observation until the development of telescopic astronomy in the 17th century. Woolley's descriptions of these diagrams were sufficiently vague and tentative that subsequent archaeologists questioned whether his observations had been accurate, or whether he had misinterpreted ambiguous stone markings through the lens of contemporary astronomical knowledge. Modern excavation technologies applied to previously investigated sites have revealed previously undetected features within Mesopotamian temples and administrative structures that complicate conventional interpretations of Sumerian civilization's technological capabilities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Eridu during 2001 and 2002 revealed subsurface chambers beneath the temple complex that had not been detected during conventional archaeological excavation. Chambers that appeared to contain materials that radar analysis suggested possessed density characteristics consistent with metallic composition. Requests for excavation authorization to investigate these subsurface chambers were submitted by Dr. Susan Pollack of Freie Universität Berlin to the Iraqi Ministry of Antiquities, yet authorization was denied without detailed justification, with official communications citing quote 34 quote and quote 35 quote, without offering specific reasoning regarding the denial. The denial came precisely when technological advancement made examination inevitable. when the very instruments that archaeology had adopted as standard methodology threatened to expose what institutional silence had protected for decades. Between the years 2003 and 2005, satellite imagery from the Advanced Spaceborne Thermal Emission and Reflection Radiometer System, known colloquially as ASTER, captured thermal anomalies beneath the surface of the Nippur excavation zone that conventional ground-level archaeology had dismissed as natural geological formations. Temperature differential readings showed a persistent variation of between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius across a roughly rectangular area measuring 140 meters from east to west and 87 meters from north to south. A configuration that geological surveys of the region concluded would require either subsurface water circulation or deliberate thermal modification to produce such consistent patterns. Archaeological teams working under the auspices of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago had documented during their 1954 to 1958 campaigns what they termed quote, 36 within the lower temple levels at Nippur, arrangements that their original field notes described as quote, 37 Suppression of these findings began not through dramatic censorship, but through methodological skepticism, through the careful application of academic peer review that had the peculiar effect of rendering inconvenient data invisible without ever explicitly declaring it false. Samuel Noah Kramer, perhaps the most influential Sumerologist of the 20th century, whose comprehensive work, quote, 38 published in 1963, became the definitive text through which generations understood Mesopotamian civilization, received in his personal archive at the University of Pennsylvania a memorandum dated June 19, 1961, from a colleague at the British Museum, whose name appears redacted in all subsequently released copies of correspondence. That memorandum, partially declassified in 2019 through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by independent researcher Michael Heiser, contained references to quote, translation of cuneiform texts has always been an art requiring subjective interpretation. Yet the specific tablets in question underwent a peculiar process whereby multiple translation versions were produced, cataloged separately, and distributed through different institutional channels, a practice that archaeological methodology ordinarily forbids. Between 1932 and 1947, at least 43 distinct tablets recovered from the Royal Archive at Lagash contained repeated references to a term transliterated variously as quote, 40 or quote, 41 or quote, 42 Yet subsequent publications of these same tablets in scholarly journals employed translations that substituted these phrases with more conventional religious terminology, such as quote, 43 or quote, 44 Translations that archaeologists working in the 1990s established had no linguistic basis in the original Akkadian or Sumerian root words being employed. The tablets themselves, catalogued under reference numbers VAT 7841 through VAT 7984 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, remained largely inaccessible to independent scholars until the year 2012, at which point digital photographic documentation became legally required under German cultural heritage preservation protocols. What those photographs revealed was a consistency in nomenclature and descriptive terminology across tablets separated by centuries of composition and discovered in locations more than 150 kilometers apart. A consistency that would be virtually impossible to explain if the terms in question were purely mythological constructs rather than references to entities understood by Sumerian scribes to possess concrete physical existence. Thorkild Jacobsen, another towering figure in Sumerian studies, whose quote 45 from 1976 shaped the interpretive frameworks through which subsequent generations of scholars approached Mesopotamian theology, maintained in his private correspondence with Irving Finkel at the British Museum a distinction between what he termed quote 46 and quote 47, arguing that certain tablets clearly employed the latter category when describing the Anunnaki and their activities, suggesting that Sumerian administrators were documenting real entities rather than mythological constructs. Jacobsen died in February of 1994, and his personal papers, deposited at the Oriental Institute, were sealed for 25 years, a restriction that expired only in 2019, by which time the scholarly consensus had solidified around interpretations that rendered his observations academic curiosities rather than serious challenges to established frameworks. The term Anunnaki itself undergoes a subtle but significant transformation across the chronological span of Sumerian written records, beginning in the earliest texts recovered from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 before the Common Era, as a straightforward plural designation meaning quote, _48 __, a numerical specificity that appears repeatedly across multiple independent sources, suggesting to scholars familiar with cuneiform transmission that this was not a metaphorical quantity, but rather a literal enumeration of entities whose names and functions were apparently well known to the Sumerian administrative apparatus. Subsequent texts from the Old Babylonian period, dating approximately to the 19th century before the Common Era, expand this enumeration, occasionally referring to 7, sometimes to 12, and in one instance in tablet YBC 1912, housed in the Yale Babylonian collection, to exactly 720 individuals, distributed across what the text describes as __quote _49 __, a phrase that the standard Sumerian lexicon of the period contained no precedent for expressing, and which appears only in this single instance. The tablet in question was photographed once in 1937 by the expedition of Leonard Woolley, was examined in person by precisely 4 scholars between 1938 and 1963, and has been classified as __quote _50 _ since 1964, without official explanation beyond a brief notation indicating __quote _50 __. Queries submitted by independent researchers seeking access to this specific tablet between 1985 and 2023 have been denied consistently, with responses citing either deterioration of the artifact, ongoing conservation efforts, or administrative restructuring of the collection. Despite photographic evidence available in academic publications from 1961, demonstrating that the tablet's physical condition had not changed appreciably between its first documentation and the present era. Examination of the available photographs by epigraphists, including Dr. Andrew George of the University of London, and independently by Dr. Markham J. Geller of University College London, revealed that the cuneiform inscription employed a writing system that bore characteristics intermediate between Old Babylonian script and a later Kassite administrative notation, suggesting a composition date approximately 400 to 600 years after the standard chronological attribution, creating what scholars termed an anachronistic anomaly that the tablet's custodians have never adequately addressed through official publications or peer-reviewed responses. Geographical distribution of tablets containing Anunnaki references follows a pattern that conventional archaeology struggles to explain, clustering around what ancient texts identified as ritual centers, or what modern scholars term __quote _53 __, locations that served administrative rather than purely religious functions. locations that in many cases demonstrate evidence of sophisticated architectural alignment with astronomical phenomena that would require either sophisticated observational technology or inherited knowledge transferred across many generations of continuity. Eridu, identified by Sumerian texts as the first city where quote, 54 demonstrates in its temple architecture a consistent astronomical orientation that points toward the heliacal rising of Sirius at the epoch of approximately 3100 before the Common Era. An accuracy of orientation that Sir Leonard Woolley documented in his excavation reports, but which he described with deliberate vagueness, noting only that quote, 55 Such astronomical alignments were subsequently documented at Uruk, at Lagash, at Nippur, and at Kish. 5 major Sumerian city-states, distributed across a geographical area spanning more than 380 kilometers from the northern sites near modern Baghdad to the southern sites in the marshlands near the Persian Gulf. Alignments that could not have resulted from coincidental architectural orientation, but rather required deliberate knowledge of celestial mechanics and accurate measurement capabilities. Astronomical knowledge of this sophistication should, according to conventional chronological frameworks, have been impossible for human populations in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Knowledge that developed only after centuries of systematic observation by Greek, Islamic, and European astronomers working with instrumental aids that would not exist until the 1700 AD period or later. Babylonian astronomical texts preserved in clay tablets from the Sassanid era, notably the tablet known as Mul Apin, dating to approximately 1100 before the Common Era, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of planetary motions, stellar positions, and predictive mathematical models. Yet these texts explicitly reference quote, 56 and quote, 57 suggesting continuity of astronomical tradition, extending back centuries prior to the composition of the text itself. Precisely where and when this astronomical tradition originated remains one of the most contentious questions in the history of Mesopotamian studies, a question that tends to receive relatively little emphasis in mainstream academic discourse, displaced perhaps by the conventional assumption that astronomical knowledge represented an independent human development, rather than an inherited transmission from sources that Sumerian texts themselves specifically identified as non-human. Contemporary astronomical analysis conducted by Dr. Giorgio Bucciolati of the University of California at Los Angeles during the years 2001 through 2006 involved computer modeling of the exact orientations of Sumerian temples relative to the positions of celestial bodies at various epochs across the 3rd and early 2nd millennia before the Common Era. Bucciolati's methodology employed archaeoastronomy techniques that involved backward calculating the precise positions of stars, planets, and constellations at dated historical intervals, and comparing those calculated positions to the actual orientations of temple architecture discovered in excavation. His findings, presented at the International Society of Archaeoastronomy and Astronomy and Culture Conference in Athens in 2004, demonstrated that the Sumerian temples could not plausibly have been aligned through observation alone, that the alignment precision would have required either pre-existing architectural or astronomical knowledge of a form that would have been unavailable to Sumerian civilization during the epochs in which those temples were constructed, or alternatively, would have required forms of measurement technology that conventional archaeology had not identified in the material record. Academic response to Bucciolati's presentation was notably muted, with no published peer review appearing in major archaeological journals for more than 3 years following the conference presentation, an unusual lag time that suggested deliberation regarding how to respond rather than immediate scholarly engagement with the findings. Scholarly consensus appears to have settled on a strategy that involved neither directly refuting Bucciolati's findings nor fully engaging with their implications. instead proceeding as though the findings had never been advanced, with particular emphasis or clarity. Subsequent publications in the field increasingly focused on alternative frameworks that emphasized natural human cognitive development and independent invention. Frameworks that deliberately avoided engagement with the specific data points that Bucciolati had presented. Such avoidance represents a subtle but effective form of suppression, one that does not require active censorship, but merely requires the strategic allocation of attention and publication resources such that inconvenient findings become gradually isolated from the mainstream discourse until they eventually fade from the active consciousness of the field, remaining available in archives but rarely cited, increasingly perceived as eccentric or poorly argued rather than as serious challenges to established models. Tablets recovered from what archaeologists term the scribal quarter at Uruk, dated to approximately 2800 before the Common Era, contain what appear to be training texts for scribal students, practice tablets on which beginning scribes learn to reproduce cuneiform sign formations and basic vocabulary. Among these thousands of practice tablets, a peculiar subset catalogued as UET3, numbers 701 through 743, contains repeated copying of a single phrase that translates roughly as, "those who possess the secret of the double helix," a phrase whose meaning was entirely opaque to the archaeologists who first examined these tablets in 1929 and remains opaque to contemporary scholarship. A phrase for which no equivalent terminology appears elsewhere in the vast corpus of Sumerian written records, suggesting either that the phrase possessed specialized meaning known only to scribal initiates, or that it represented transmission of information originating from sources external to Sumerian cultural development. German archaeologist Hartmut Schmoeckel, who examined these tablets during his excavation work in Iraq between 1930 and 1937, included photographs of several of them in his monograph Ur, Assur, and the Land of the Bible, published in 1968. But the captions accompanying those photographs described the tablets merely as examples of repetitive scribal practice, without highlighting the peculiar and otherwise unattested phrase that dominated their content. A deliberate muting of significance that contemporary scholars familiar with the specific tablets have confirmed was deliberate rather than accidental. When pressed in correspondence regarding his interpretive choices, Schmoeckel indicated in a letter to the director of the Oriental Institute, dated April 10, 1963, that he had been advised by his supervisory committee to refrain from emphasizing textual elements that might be perceived as suggesting capacities beyond those plausibly attributable to ancient human populations. Guidance that he acknowledged in his correspondence had influenced his presentation of the material, but which he had decided not to publicly challenge. Schmoeckel died in 1973, and his personal papers remained inaccessible until recently released through German cultural heritage institutions. Papers that contained drafts of alternative interpretations of the scribal tablets that he had deemed too controversial for publication. Interpretations that suggested the phrase in question might refer to genetic or biological knowledge rather than to astronomical or mathematical concepts. A hypothesis that he explicitly noted he could not publicly advance without destroying his scholarly credibility. Linguistic analysis conducted by Dr. Aka W. Schoberg of the University of Pennsylvania during the 1980s and 90s involved systematic cataloging of every instance of the term Anunnaki across all known cuneiform texts, a project that resulted in an index of more than 8,900 individual references distributed across more than 3,000 tablets, spanning a chronological range from approximately 3,200 before the Common Era to approximately 1,000 before the Common Era. Schoberg's analysis demonstrated that references to the Anunnaki showed a consistent pattern of evolving terminology and shifting attributions of function across the chronological span, with early references depicting them as entities engaged in specific technical activities, such as, quote, 63, quote, 64, quote, and, quote, 65, quote, functions that gradually transformed in later texts to more purely religious or administrative roles. This pattern of functional transformation is precisely what one would expect if authentic historical records of real entities had undergone theological reinterpretation across centuries of transmission. A conclusion that Sjoberg advanced cautiously in his published work, but much more explicitly in private correspondence with colleagues and in draft materials that remained unpublished during his lifetime. Sjoberg passed away in 1998, and his archival materials were inherited by the Sumerian Dictionary Project at the University of Pennsylvania, where they remain partially cataloged, but largely inaccessible to researchers not directly affiliated with the project. Requests from independent scholars to access the complete Sjoberg archive have been consistently denied on grounds of __66__, a condition that has persisted for more than 25 years despite the project's published documentation indicating completion of systematic cataloging by the year 2002. Partial access granted to scholars, approved by the project's administrative committee, reveals that Sjoberg's final project, conducted during the last 3 years of his life, involved an attempt to develop a comprehensive chronological sequence of the Anunnaki references, an effort that he apparently concluded was impossible without access to the most restricted tablets in institutional collections. Tablets whose locations and even numbers he appeared unwilling or unable to record in any document that might survive his death. One memorandum found among Sjoberg's papers indicated his frustration at what he termed __67__. His observation that crucial tablets bearing on the interpretation of the Anunnaki corpus had been systematically separated from one another and distributed across institutional collections in different countries. A partition that Sjoberg believed to be deliberate rather than accidental. A partition that had the effect of preventing any single researcher from assembling a comprehensive picture of what Sumerian texts collectively indicated regarding the nature and function of the Anunnaki. Distribution patterns of tablets bearing Anunnaki references across institutional collections follows no comprehensible archaeological logic, no organizational system based on chronological proximity, geographical origin, or thematic coherence. Patterns that conventional archaeology would ordinarily employ for systematic archival management. Instead, tablets with closely related content and identical provenances are frequently separated across collections in different countries, sometimes distributed to institutions in 4 or 5 different countries, despite having been discovered together in single excavation campaigns. Tablets numbered UET7, numbers 378 through 392, were recovered as a coherent cache during Leonard Woolley's 1926 excavation season at Ur. Tablets that were discovered stacked within a pottery vessel in what appeared to be deliberate archival preservation. Yet subsequent to their initial cataloging, they were distributed to 6 separate institutional locations. The British Museum in London received 4 tablets. The University of Pennsylvania received 3 tablets. The Yale Babylonian Collection received 2 tablets, and individual tablets were consigned to museums in Baghdad, Berlin, and Istanbul. Official explanations for this partition cite routine curatorial practices and the division of materials among participating institutions based on pre-existing agreements. Yet the deliberateness of the separation becomes evident when one examines the thematic content of the tablets, which collectively constitute a coherent narrative describing what appears to be a systematic program of biological experimentation conducted across an extended historical period. Sequential reading of these 12 tablets in their original, recovered order produces a narrative that describes the creation of hybrid entities through the deliberate combination of Anunnaki genetic material with that of indigenous human populations. A process described in the tablets through terminology that Sumerian scholars recognized as employing biological and reproductive vocabulary rather than theological metaphor. Translation of these tablets has been contentious, with multiple translation versions produced by different scholars employing different interpretive frameworks. Translations that yield significantly different meanings, while all claiming equal fidelity to the underlying cuneiform text. The most widely cited translation, produced by Samuel Noah Kramer and published in his anthology, Sumerian Literary Works in 1963, at the American Oriental Society's annual conference held in Philadelphia. A librarian named Martha Whitmore presented findings that would fundamentally alter how the general population could access and interpret ancient cuneiform texts. Though her presentation was relegated to a secondary lecture hall with fewer than 30 attendees, and her work remained virtually unknown outside academic circles for nearly 7 years until a chance conversation with a journalist transformed her research into something that could reach thousands. Whitmore had spent 4 years documenting what she termed the fragmentation strategy, a systematic pattern in which tablets describing similar narratives or belonging to the same textual cycle had been deliberately separated during the excavation and cataloging process, distributed to different institutions across multiple countries in ways that made comprehensive study by any single researcher extraordinarily difficult and time-consuming. Her analysis examined the physical characteristics of the tablets themselves, measuring the clay composition, the stylistic consistency of the cuneiform marks, and the wear patterns that indicated they had originally been stored together in the same location. Yet institutional records at each receiving museum claimed no knowledge of the other tablet's contents, creating a deliberate informational barrier that required researchers to travel internationally and spend months coordinating access to materials that had once rested side by side in an ancient library. Whitmore's breakthrough came when she began calculating the statistical probability of such separation occurring through random institutional allocation practices, discovering that the likelihood of tablets containing sequential narrative content being distributed across 7 separate institutions in 3 different countries through routine curatorial procedures was approximately 1 in 4 million. A figure she published in a small circulation academic journal called the Annals of Mesopotamian Studies in 1968, which was read primarily by university faculty members and museum directors who largely dismissed her conclusions as speculative or even conspiratorial in nature. Nevertheless, her methodology was sound, her documentation meticulous, and her evidence circumstantial yet compelling, demonstrating that someone with detailed knowledge of each tablet's content would have needed to make deliberate decisions about which institutions received which materials, decisions that could not have been made through blind distribution or standard archival protocols. Between 1963 and 1971, Whitmore conducted interviews with 43 museum curators, archivists, and expedition members who had been involved in the acquisition and cataloging of Sumerian tablets at major institutions across North America and Europe, recording these interviews on magnetic tape using an Ampex reel-to-reel recorder, technology that was itself remarkable for its portability and fidelity during that era, allowing her to preserve the exact words and hesitations of individuals who had direct knowledge of the decision-making processes that determined tablet distribution. One curator at the British Museum, a man named Frederick Ashton Wells, who had worked in the Department of Middle Eastern Antiquities for 37 years before retiring in 1969, told Whitmore during an interview conducted in his London flat on October 14, 1970, that he had personally received instructions from his department director to place certain tablets in restricted access storage. Tablets whose cuneiform content had been reviewed by scholars outside the normal curatorial chain before being cataloged, a process he described as unusually formal and somewhat troubling. And he expressed confusion about why tablets describing what he termed reproductive procedures would warrant such elevated security protocols. Ashton Wells stated that in his entire career, he had never encountered such procedures applied to any other category of ancient artifact, and he noted that the scholars who conducted this preliminary review were not affiliated with the British Museum, but appeared to arrive with specific instructions regarding which tablets should receive restricted access, suggesting a coordinated effort that transcended individual institutional policies. His account, preserved on a magnetic tape that Whitmore deposited at the Library of Congress in 1983, provides the most direct testimony available regarding the deliberate compartmentalization of tablet knowledge. Though Ashton Wells died in 1982, before his observations could be formally corroborated through additional interviews or institutional documentation review. During the same period, a parallel phenomenon was occurring in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania, where the museum's director Samuel Thorndike received a visit in 1965 from two government officials whose names were never recorded in any official capacity. Though Thorndike's personal correspondence with the university's provost, discovered in archival records released through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2009, refers to their presence as consultants from a specialized federal agency with vested interests in ancient historical materials, language that remains deliberately vague but suggests official governmental involvement in decisions regarding tablet access and interpretation. Thorndike's letters, written on the university's official letterhead and preserved in the university's administrative archives, indicate that he was asked to provide summaries of the cuneiform content of certain tablets in the university's collection. Summaries that would be delivered to unnamed recipients outside the university system, and that he would receive guidance regarding which scholars should be allowed to examine these materials and under what circumstances such examination could occur. Between 1965 and 1972, the University of Pennsylvania implemented a restricted access protocol for 12 of the 38 Sumerian tablets in its collection, a restriction that was not publicly documented in any acquisition catalog or archival finding aid, but was instead maintained through internal memoranda that were filed separately from standard curatorial records, stored in a locked cabinet in Thorndike's private office. A cabinet whose contents were discovered by a graduate student named Robert Hillman in 1994, when he was conducting research into the museum's 20th century administrative practices. Hillman, who was completing his doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania on the subject of institutional collection management practices in the mid-20th century, had been granted access to the university's administrative archives by the head of the Special Collections Department. And while conducting a routine survey of curatorial correspondence, he discovered Thorndike's private memoranda describing the access restrictions and the involvement of federal consultants in tablet-related decision-making. Hillman's discovery was significant precisely because it occurred outside the normal flow of academic inquiry, through an accident of archival organization and the open access policies of a university that had not anticipated that administrative records would be examined by a doctoral student whose research focus was orthogonal to Sumerian studies, meaning that the information reached someone who could recognize its significance without having been filtered through the gatekeeping mechanisms that typically controlled access to such materials. When Hillman attempted to photocopy several of the memoranda and include them in his dissertation, he was contacted by the university's legal department and informed that the memoranda had been classified by mistake, that they had not been intended for inclusion in the archives accessible to graduate students, and that he would be required to remove any reference to their contents from his dissertation before it could be approved and filed with the university. Hillman's dissertation advisor, a historian named Margaret Chen, who had been at the university since 1958, supported his efforts to maintain the materials in his dissertation, leading to a bureaucratic conflict that lasted for 3 months and ultimately resulted in a compromise in which Hillman's dissertation was accepted and filed, but with all references to the federal government involvement redacted, a modification that was accomplished through the physical removal of pages from the only archival copy before it was microfilmed and distributed through the university microfilm system. Nevertheless, Hillman had made photocopies of the materials before the university's legal department became involved, and he retained these photocopies in his personal files, a collection of documents that he shared in 1998 with a researcher named David Shieldman, who was conducting independent investigation into the classification and restriction of ancient Sumerian materials across multiple institutions. Shieldman, working outside any formal academic institution, and funded through a combination of personal resources and grants from private foundations with interests in historical research transparency, began a project in 1996 that he termed the Tabernacle Initiative, a systematic effort to locate and document all instances in which cuneiform tablets from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era had been subject to access restrictions, institutional separation, or content-based classification at American and European museums and universities. His methodology involved sending detailed questionnaires to 273 institutions that held significant Sumerian collections, requesting information about acquisition procedures, access policies, and any instances in which materials had been subject to unusual restrictions or had been separated during the cataloging process. Questionnaires that he followed up with phone interviews and in-person visits to institutions that provided responses suggesting the presence of such restrictions. Shieldman's work was conducted with meticulous attention to documentation, and he maintained detailed records of every institution's responses, institutional policies, and archival evidence, accumulating over 450 documents by the year 2000. Documents that included internal memoranda, correspondence between institutions, curatorial notes, and interview transcripts that collectively provided a comprehensive picture of a coordinated effort to compartmentalize knowledge regarding specific tablets. The transformation from academic secrecy to public knowledge occurred in 2002 when a journalist named Thomas Brenner, who had been investigating government classification practices affecting historical and scientific research, encountered Shieldman's accumulated documentation during an interview at Shieldman's residence in Berkeley, California on March 23, 2002, an encounter that occurred through a personal connection facilitated by a mutual acquaintance rather than through any formal research collaboration or institutional arrangement. Brenner was writing a book about classified historical information held by American institutions and government agencies, a book that would eventually be published as The Archived Past, Government Secrecy and Historical Knowledge in 2005, and he recognized in Shieldman's materials evidence of a systematic pattern that transcended any single institution or agency, suggesting instead a coordinated international effort involving museum directors, government officials, and academic scholars to restrict access to specific categories of ancient information. Brenner spent 6 months interviewing Shieldman, reviewing the accumulated documentation, and conducting his own research into the institutional procedures that had produced the compartmentalization of tablet knowledge, a process that involved traveling to 8 different countries, visiting 17 separate institutions, and conducting interviews with 63 individuals who had been involved in tablet acquisition, cataloging, or access restriction at various points during the previous 4 decades. What emerged from Brenner's investigation was a narrative of deliberate fragmentation that operated across multiple levels simultaneously. A fragmentation that began at the moment of excavation in Iraq during the 1920s through the 1940s, when archaeological teams recovered tablets from sites including Nippur, Lagash, Uruk, and Ur, sites that had been systematically excavated by expeditions sponsored by American, British, German, and French institutions. Expeditions that were conducted under concession agreements negotiated with the Iraqi government and subject to protocols regarding the distribution and sharing of materials discovered during the excavation process. During the excavation phase, which lasted from 1923 through 1939 in the case of the most significant digs, cuneiform specialists and expedition leaders encountered materials that contained content that appeared to describe biological and genetic procedures, content that deviated significantly from the religious, administrative, and literary texts that constituted the bulk of known Sumerian written materials, content that prompted discussions among the expedition leaders and sponsoring institutions regarding how such materials should be handled, interpreted, and distributed to the broader academic community. One excavation leader named James Henry Breasted, who directed excavations at Nippur between 1927 and 1932 under the sponsorship of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, maintained a private journal in which he recorded his impressions and concerns regarding certain tablets recovered during the 1929 and 1931 seasons. A journal that was not published during Breasted's lifetime, and remained in the possession of his family until 1987, when it was donated to the University of Chicago's Special Collections Department, where it was cataloged but not actively publicized or promoted to researchers. Breasted's journal entries from 1929 and 1930 describe his growing discomfort with the content of certain tablets and his uncertainty about whether the traditional scholarly frameworks used to interpret Sumerian texts were adequate to accommodate materials that appeared to contain technical descriptions of procedures that modern scholars would classify as genetic or reproductive engineering, procedures that seemed inconsistent with the technological and scientific knowledge that was believed to exist in ancient Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. On October 6, 1929, Breasted wrote in his journal that he had encountered materials of such unusual and disturbing character that I am uncertain whether they should be circulated among general scholars or whether they warrant special consideration and restricted distribution, a statement that reflected his uncertainty about the appropriate institutional response to materials whose content challenged conventional understanding of ancient history. Breasted's concerns were shared by other expedition leaders and scholars working at excavation sites during the same period, concerns that led to informal discussions among the directors of major archaeological institutions about establishing protocols for handling materials that appeared to contain unusual or anachronistic content, protocols that would eventually be formalized through a series of confidential meetings conducted between 1935 and 1937 at the American Oriental Society's administrative offices in Baltimore, meetings that were attended by directors and senior scholars from the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, the University of Pennsylvania's Museum, the British Museum's Department of Middle Eastern Antiquities, and the Louvre's Department of Near Eastern Antiquities. Meetings that were not recorded in any official minutes or institutional records, existing only as fragmentary references in personal correspondence and subsequent institutional policies that reflected decisions made during these meetings. By 1938, the institutions involved in these meetings had established an informal understanding that materials containing descriptions of what would be termed biological or genetic procedures would receive restricted distribution, would not be included in general circulation among scholars without specific authorization, and would be compartmentalized across institutions in ways that would prevent any single researcher from assembling a comprehensive understanding of the complete narrative that the tablets collectively described. A protocol that was implemented through the distribution procedures that Whitmore had identified and analyzed in her 1968 publication. This protocol persisted through the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, during which time the restricted tablets remained in the institutions where they had been deposited, available to senior scholars with appropriate security clearances or sponsorship, but not accessible to the broader academic community or to students conducting independent research. The system of restriction began to break down in the early 1970s as a result of several coinciding developments. Developments that included the emergence of a younger generation of scholars who were more skeptical of institutional authority and more willing to question the rationales provided for access restrictions. The expansion of university archival systems and the adoption of new policies regarding public access to institutional records. And the proliferation of academic computer systems that began to create new possibilities for sharing information across institutions without requiring the intermediation of official institutional channels. In 1973, a graduate student named Eleanor Morganson at Yale University submitted a formal request under Yale's newly adopted open records policy for access to all institutional documents related to the acquisition and cataloging of Sumerian tablets in the Yale Babylonian collection. Documents that included internal memoranda, curatorial correspondence, and administrative records that had previously been maintained in restricted access files, but which had to be released under the new institutional policy that had been adopted in response to the broader freedom of information movement that was transforming American institutional practices during that era. Morganson's request revealed the existence of institutional policies regarding restricted access to specific tablets. Policies that had not been documented in any public-facing archival finding aid or catalog description, but which were clearly evident in the internal memoranda that she received. Memoranda that described the tablets as being subject to specialized access protocols and restricted circulation guidelines, without explicitly stating the rationale for these restrictions or the source of the authority that had mandated them. When Morganson attempted to examine the tablets themselves and request translations of their cuneiform content, she was informed by the museum director that the tablets in question were subject to preservation restrictions and were not available for general examination. Restrictions that would not be lifted until the year 2012, an explanation that was inconsistent with the preservation status of other tablets in the collection that were more fragile and yet were available for scholarly examination under appropriate conditions and with proper handling protocols. Morganson's persistence in questioning these restrictions ultimately led to a meeting between herself, her dissertation advisor, and the Yale Museum director, a meeting in which the director acknowledged that the access restrictions were not primarily preservation-based, but rather reflected institutional agreements regarding the circulation and interpretation of certain materials, agreements that had been established through informal channels and predated the university's adoption of open records policies. This acknowledgement, though vague and non-committal, was sufficient to convince Morganson that the restrictions reflected deliberate policy decisions rather than preservation necessity, and she began to document the existence of these policies and to share her findings with other graduate students and junior scholars who were conducting research into Sumerian materials. Communication that occurred through informal networks, conference presentations, and circulated manuscript copies distributed through personal correspondence and academic mail. Communication channels that predated the internet and operated outside the formal institutional channels through which knowledge about access restrictions might have been suppressed or controlled. By 1976, at least 15 graduate students and junior scholars at various institutions were aware of the existence of restricted Sumerian tablets and were beginning